Cold graves. The village of Tsafan lay shrouded in a blanket of perpetual winter. Nestled within the shadow of towering, snow-capped mountains, it was a place forgotten by the world. The air was thick with the scent of pine and an ominous silence that lingered like an unspoken warning. This isolation made it the perfect destination for Professor Ezra Ben-Shalom, a seasoned archaeologist whose obsession with uncovering ancient mysteries had brought him to the edge of the world. Ezra had heard whispers of the cold graves from an old manuscript he had stumbled upon in a dusty Tel Aviv library. The text told of an ancient burial ground hidden deep within the icy wilderness of Tsafan, from which the dead slept uneasily. Legend had it that those who disturbed the graves were cursed, their fates sealed by forces beyond human understanding. For Ezra, the legends were nothing more than exaggerated folklore, tales spun by fearful villagers to deter unwanted visitors. Upon arriving in Tsafan, Ezra found the village to be as unwelcoming as the stories had portrayed. The people welcomed him with watchful eyes and pursed lips. Even though it was obvious that they were uncomfortable, Ezra was determined. He armed himself with his notebooks, tools, and an iron will to find the graves. There, Yitzhak was the old man leading him through the dense forest, it seemed. "You shouldn't be here," Yitzhak growled, his eyes dropping from the snow-covered trail, which reached to knee-high levels. "Cold graves should not be unearthed. Grounds are holy and cursed." Ezra nodded politely to Yitzhak's warnings. His scientific mind refused to entertain the idea of curses. Yet, as they pressed deeper into the wilderness, a growing sense of unease began to creep over him. The wind carried an eerie, almost human-like wail, and the towering trees seemed to close in around them, casting long, skeletal shadows. By dusk, they arrived at the site. The graves lay in a desolate clearing, marked by ancient, frost-covered stones. Each grave was adorned with symbols Ezra could not decipher. Twisting, serpentine markings that seemed to pulse faintly under the moonlight. As Ezra pitched camp, a sense of unease seemed to creep in, like he was being watched by eyes not seen in the darkness. He could not convince Yitzhak to spend the night, and left alone with his thoughts and the haunting whispers of the wind. Unfazed, Ezra began to work, sketching each symbol and documenting his observations. Hours later, as he examined a particularly large headstone, a strange sound broke the silence. A low, guttural growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Ezra froze, his breath visible in the freezing air. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified. As the midnight hour drew close, Ezra called it a night. As he did up his tent, a subtle shake came through his footings. The chilling frost engulfed the area, far colder than was even felt outside. And to one and all, the graffiti started to flicker upon those tombs. The pulse now had an almost heartbeat pace. It barely gave Ezra time to react. Emerging from the forest was a tall, gaunt figure in tattered black robes. Its face wasn't visible, but something within its presence seemed to send forth malice. The skeletal hand pointed straight at Ezra. A hollow, resonant voice echoed through the clearing. "You trespass in a place where you are not wanted. Leave, or face the wrath of the forgotten." Ezra's heart pounded. However, his curiosity gained the better of his fear. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure did not respond, instead began to dissolve into air, leaving behind an icy gust that extinguished Ezra's lantern. Alone in the suffocating darkness, Ezra realized he had awakened something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The frost-bitten morning in Tsafan was as bleak as the night before. The clearing where Ezra Ben-Shalom had seen the hooded stranger now seemed eerily still, as if the earth itself had held its breath in expectation. Ezra awoke to find his tent was covered in a thick layer of ice, far more than the night's cold should have produced. The glowing symbols on the gravestones had faded. but the pulsing light of their memory was seared into his mind. Yet despite his logic, Ezra could not deny the feeling that the apparition's threat had indeed been a little more than a delusion. Then again, there was a scientist within him. Fear and fatigue had been playing with his head. With this newfound energy, he began to work harder. He decided to dig up the smallest of all the graves, its headstone bearing symbols seemingly less intricate. It could belong to someone of lower status, a servant or commoner perhaps. He began to gently brush away the layers of snow and dirt. Hours passed, and the chill of day deepened. Ezra finally unearthed the lid of an ancient stone coffin, with edges worn smooth by the passage of time. It was covered in strange claw-like marks etched onto the surface, as if something tried to claw its way out. The sight sent shivers down his spine, but he pressed on. As the lid creaked and shifted slightly, a frozen gust escaped within, carrying with it the faintest hint of decay. Ezra steeled himself and lifted the lid completely. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, his bones unnaturally blackened, as though scorched by fire. Clutched in the bony fingers was a strange, crystalline shard that seemed to emit a faint blue glow. Ezra stretched to touch the shard. His fingers brushed it, and at once a fiery agony ripped up his arm. He jerked away, holding onto his hand as the shard shone brighter. For a flash of a second, he could hear the whisperings overlapping voices, incomprehensible in the language of the speaker. Shaken, Ezra returned to the village that evening, the shard carefully wrapped and secured in his pack. The villagers noticed his return and gathered around him, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and anger. "You touched it, didn't you?" An elderly woman named Rivka accused, her voice trembling. "You've doomed us all." Ezra frowned. "What are you talking about? This is an archaeological site. There's nothing supernatural here." Rivka stepped forward, her arthritic hands grasping his arm. "These graves are where the cursed dead lay. The fragment you have discovered is actually a piece of the curse. It chains the souls of the damned to the eternal jailhouse. You have now disturbed them," she concluded. The crowd nodded and murmured in agreement as the feeling of fear surrounded Ezra. He tried to make them see reason. However, Rivka's words still lingered within his head. That night, as he sat in the small cabin he had hired to review his notes, the whispers returned. These were louder, more pressing, filling the room with an oppressive weight. Air grew cold, and his breath became visible. Suddenly, the candle on his desk started to flicker violently and went out. In the dark, Ezra caught the shadow of movement crossing the room. Ezra stopped, his heart thudding in his chest, as a figure coalesced next to the window. It was the same robed creature he had seen by the gravesite. "You were warned," it said, its hollow voice carrying through the room. "The shard is not yours to take. Return it, or face the wrath of the forgotten." Ezra pulled up his courage. "What is this shard? Why does it matter?" The figure did not respond. It raised its skeletal hand, and the shard in Ezra's pack began to glow fiercely, filling the room with its light. The voices grew deafening, and Ezra fell to his knees, clutching his head as visions flooded his mind. Scenes of fire, destruction, and grotesque, shadowy figures tormenting the living. When the visions stopped, Ezra found himself alone once again, and the cabin was eerily quiet. He knew he could not leave the shard now. Its importance was too great. However, he also realized the danger he had unleashed. Between his scientific curiosity and the need to protect the village, Ezra made a fateful decision. He would pursue his investigation, but this time, he would dig deeper into the legends surrounding the cold graves. He would uncover the truth about the shard and the curse, no matter the cost. Unbeknownst to him, shadows stirred beneath the snow outside, and unseen eyes watched his every move. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick gray clouds over Tzafon. Ezra Ben-Shalom awoke to an unsettling stillness. Outside his cabin, the village seemed eerily quiet, its usual sounds of life muffled as though the snow itself had absorbed them. His thoughts were racing back to the shard, now safely ensconced in a lead-lined box. The visions of the previous night still lingered in his mind, vivid and terrifying. Yet his resolve to uncover the truth had only grown stronger. Ezra had spent hours poring over his notes, comparing the symbols on the gravestones with ancient texts. The patterns began to form a chilling narrative. The graves were not just burial sites. They were prisons, designed to contain something far more sinister than the dead. Ezra resolved to pay another visit to Rivka. If anybody knew the truth about the graves and the shard, it was her. Stepping out into the frozen air, he noticed something odd. The snow around his cabin had melted in strange circular patterns, revealing patches of blackened earth beneath. It was as if the ground itself had been burned. He walked to Rivka's little house, which could not help but fill his mind with the conviction that he was being led. Every little while he would catch something out of the corner of an eye, a disappearing shadow when he turned, a darting figure in the distance. Rivka was serious. "You have brought it here, have you?" she asked without words of greeting. Ezra hesitated before nodding. "I have hidden it. But I have to know what it is. What do these symbols mean? What is this shard?" Rivka sighed heavily, gesturing for him to sit by the fire. "The shard is a fragment of the Aishet Kaver, the Grave Mother. She was a guardian once, tasked with keeping the dead at rest. But her power was corrupted by those who sought to use it for their own gain. They trapped her essence in shards, burying them with their dead to contain her rage." Ezra leaned forward, his heart pounding. "And now that I've disturbed it, she will awaken," Rivka whispered. "Her wrath will consume everything unless the shard is returned to its rightful place. But the cost may be more than you are willing to pay." That night, Ezra stayed in his cabin, determined to decipher more of the inscriptions he had documented. As he worked, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept across the windows, and the faint whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The lead-lined box containing the shard suddenly began to rattle violently. Ezra stared in horror as the box slid off the table, spilling its contents onto the floor. The shard lay there, glowing brighter than ever, its light pulsating in sync with the whispers. Before he could even react, the room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the shard, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. One shadow began to grow, stretching toward Ezra like a living thing. From the darkness came a monstrous figure, twisted blackened limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Its voice was a guttural growl, barely intelligible. "You cannot escape. The curse is awake. Return what you have stolen, or face oblivion." Ezra stepped back, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The figure did not reply. Instead, it sprang at him, and the shard flared up with blinding light. When the light died back, the figure was gone, but the room lay in shambles. Realizing that he was in very great danger, Ezra realized he could not face it alone. He resolved to go to Yitzhak, the guide, who had taken him to the graves. If someone understood the terrain and its legends, it was Yitzhak. He found the old man at the edge of the village, staring out at the forest with a haunted expression. "You should have listened," Yitzhak said bitterly when Ezra explained the situation. "You've doomed us all." "I need your help," Ezra pleaded. "I have to find a way to stop this." Yitzhak hesitated before nodding. "There is a way, but it is dangerous," he said. "You must return the shard to the Grave Mother's altar, deep within the forest. But beware, the way is guarded by her servants. They will not let you pass easily. With torches, tools, and a reluctant alliance, Ezra and Yitzhak set out into the dawn. The silence of the forest was only broken by the crunch of their boots in the snow. It was darkening with each step deeper into the woods, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to block out the light. As they approached the gravesite, the air became thick and the temperature dropped even lower. The shard, now in a pouch, seemed to reverberate with excitement. Its light seeped through the fabric. When a ground beneath them gave away, Yitzhak cried out a warning. The message came too late, and in the snow, skeletal figures formed. Their hollow eyes gave off an unnatural glow. Bony hands reached out with unnatural jerking motions toward Ezra and Yitzhak. "Run!" Yitzhak shouted, but Ezra stood frozen, holding his pouch. The skeletal figures crept forward, their low voices a chilling chorus. Return the shard, or die. The forest seemed alive. As Ezra Ben-Shalom and Yitzhak trekked deeper into the woods, it became evident that the snow-laden trees weren't just standing there. They were watching. Their gnarled branches twisted like claws, reaching toward the two intruders, and the dense canopy above swallowed the light, plunging everything into an oppressive gloom. Ezra clutched the pouch holding the shard, its faint glow a poor comfort against the palpable hostility of the forest. Yitzhak walked ahead, his torch lighting the narrow path, his face set in grim determination. "Stay close," Yitzhak whispered, his voice barely audible. "The grave mother's servants won't let us pass easily." Ezra nodded, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to turn back. But retreat wasn't an option. Not now. Their journey took them to a frozen stream, the ice gleaming like glass under the weak light of their torches. Yitzhak knelt by the water's edge, muttering a prayer under his breath. Ezra watched in silence, feeling the shard grow warmer in his pouch. Suddenly, the ice beneath their feet cracked with a deafening snap. Shadows rippled across the frozen surface, and from the depths emerged figures cloaked in ice, their bodies translucent yet menacing. Their faces were featureless, save for hollow, glowing eyes that burned with malevolent intent. "They're guardians," Yitzhak said, his voice trembling. "They won't stop until we're dead." The figures moved forward, the ragged limbs of their bodies grinding on the ice in a scratchy noise that made Ezra's teeth hurt. Yitzhak pulled an oil vial from his pack and tossed it in the direction of the first figure. It shattered at its target, and the thing began to burn, its cry slicing through the forest air. "Fire!" he shouted. "It is their weakness." Ezra snatched up a torch and flailed it wildly at one of the figures, flames licking at the icy form. The creature let out a shriek and dissolved into a pile of frost, but more poured from the stream, it seemed, without end. "We can't fight them all," Ezra yelled, panic rising in his chest. Yitzhak seized his arm. "Then we run." They bolted across the frozen stream, the guardians in pursuit. The air around them grew colder with every step, their breaths freezing mid-air. Just as the creatures closed in, Yitzhak flung another vial of oil behind them, the explosion buying them precious seconds. Breathless, they entered a clearing. Trees grew in perfect circle. At the center stood a stone altar. Symbols carved in its surface resembled those upon the gravestones. Ezra moved closer cautiously, while his heart hammered inside as the shard within his pouch glowed brighter. "This is it," Yitzhak said in hushed voice, laced by relief and fear. "Mother Grave's altar." As Ezra moved closer, a voice boomed out from the clearing, low and guttural, yet unmistakably female. "You dare bring my fragment here, thief." The ground began to shudder, and the altar cracked open, tendrils of dark energy spilling forth. From the shadows emerged a towering figure cloaked in tattered black robes. Her face was obscured, but her presence was overwhelming, filling the clearing with an unbearable pressure. "The grave mother," Yitzhak whispered, falling to his knees. Ezra made himself stand upright, though his legs shook. "I stole nothing. I discovered it. I want to return it to you." Hollow eyes burned from within the darkness of the grave mother. "You bothered my rest, human. You awakened my curse. Why shouldn't I take your life as payment?" Ezra hesitated, his mind racing. "Because I can help you. I can make sure your story is told, that your tormentors are remembered for what they did to you." The grave mother let out a hollow laugh. "You think I care for mortal stories? My wrath is eternal, my hunger unending. But..." She paused, her gaze fixed on the pouch. "Return my shard, and I may spare you, for now." Ezra felt Yitzhak's hand on his arm. "Don't trust her," the old man hissed. "She lies." But Ezra knew he had no choice. Slowly, he reached into the pouch and retrieved the shard, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. As he placed it on the altar, the grave mother let out a deafening wail. The shard dissolved into a blinding light, and the ground beneath their feet began to crumble. Before Ezra could respond, the earth opened beneath him, and he was swallowed by darkness. He fell for what felt like an eternity, before landing in a cavern illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Yitzhak's voice echoed from above. "Ezra, are you alive?" "Yes," Ezra called back, though his voice wavered. "I'm somewhere below." The cavern was large, lined with rows of coffins, all with their lids open to emit that faint, blue glow. Then, at its center stood a stone throne, sitting on which sat a far more terrifying sight than the grave mother, skeletal with a crown of thorns, clutching its bony fingers around the handle of an ice scepter. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards Ezra, and the temperature dropped. "You are not meant to be here," it said, as its voice shook the walls of the cavern. With growing horror, Ezra realized he was not just over a graveyard, but an open prison. The shard was some sort of a key. He had merely unlocked much worse than that. The cavern's chilling silence was broken by the echo of Ezra's own ragged breathing. The skeletal figure on the throne radiated an aura of malevolence so intense that the very air seemed to freeze. The glowing coffins lining the cavern walls pulsed with an ominous rhythm, each beat synchronized with the shard's dissolution above. He gripped the torch well with his shaking hand. He knew he was utterly over his head. Who are you?" he tried to ask, just barely audible. The skeletal being leaned forward, its hollow eyes blazing like twin infernos. "I am Rav Keshet, the Warden of the Damned," it intoned. "You have trespassed upon the sanctity of the grave mother's seal. Now her wrath stirs, and with it, my own dominion awakens." Ezra stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "I didn't mean to disturb anything. I was just trying to return the shard." "You have done more than that," Rav Keshet replied, its voice a low rumble. "You have set in motion the unsealing of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Only blood can restore the balance now, yours or another's." Above, Yitzhak's voice broke through the stillness. "Ezra, I'm coming down." "No!" Ezra shouted, but it was too late. Moments later, Yitzhak descended on a makeshift rope, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What is this place?" Ezra pointed toward the throne. "The grave mother isn't the only one bound here. That thing says we've unleashed something." Yitzhak's eyes widened. "Then we have to leave. Now." Rav Keshet laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "Leave? There is no escape from the chains of the cursed. One of you must pay the price, or the grave mother's fury will consume this world." Ezra spun to Yitzhak, panic and guilt warring in his mind. There has to be another way. "There is none," Rav Keshet declared. "Choose, or I shall choose for you." The coffin started trembling violently before Ezra could even say something. Then skeletal warriors came from within, encased by frost on their bony frames. They moved frighteningly precisely to enclose Ezra and Yitzhak. Yitzhak took hold of the arm of Ezra. "Run!" They ran towards one end of the cavern in a dash, dodging the icy weapons of skeletal warriors. Air was cooling with each moment that passed. The frost went up their boots and made their movements hard. As they entered a narrow passage, the cavern walls groaned and began to collapse. Rav Kishet's voice boomed. "You cannot escape the Grave Mother's wrath." Ezra tripped, falling hard onto the icy ground. The pouch containing the shard's remnants spilled open, and the fragments glowed fiercely. The skeletal warriors paused, as if hesitant to approach the light. Yitzhak pulled Ezra to his feet. "The shard, use it." "I don't know how," Ezra shouted, desperation in his voice. "Trust your instincts," Yitzhak urged. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ezra clutched the glowing fragments and turned to face the skeletal warriors. The shard's light intensified, forcing them to retreat. The cavern split open, and a massive chamber appeared bathed in sickly green light. At the center stood the Grave Mother, even more terrifying than before. Her hollow eyes burned with unbridled rage, and her tattered robes billowed as if caught in an unseen storm. "You dare return to me with my own shard?" she roared, her voice shaking the very earth. Ezra stepped out, his hand trembling as the glowing fragments lay in its palm. "I come not to fight you. I came here to fix this." The Grave Mother laughed at his words as a shiver ran all over Ezra. "No rite can make this world right again. The seal is broken. And now everything will pay the price." Rav Kishet stepped out of the darkness, his skeleton imposing over Ezra. "Grave Mother, his blood can revive the seal. Let me take it and your anger will be done." Yitzhak stepped forward, his voice firm. "Take me instead." Ezra snapped his head toward Yitzhak. "No, I can't allow you to do that. You have an opportunity to put this right," Yitzhak said. "You're young, and you can ensure this truth is heard. Mine was over before you stepped foot in this accursed village." The Grave Mother looked at Yitzhak with a cold calculation. "Well then, if you will give me your life, perhaps the seal may yet be broken." Ezra tried to speak, but Yitzhak repressed him with a harsh expression. "Go, Ezra. Live. Tell the world what happened here." Before Ezra could move in, Yitzhak advanced. The Grave Mother lifted her hand and grasped the old man in black tendrils, dragging him into the altar. The cavern was filled with the shriek of wail as the shard pieces welded with the altar to trap the Grave Mother's soul yet again. Hours later, Ezra woke up near the edge of the forest, barely able to recall what had occurred that night. The village of Zaphon was no longer there. In its place was unbroken white snow, and he was holding Yitzhak's journal. It was all he knew about what happened. He knew he had a story to tell, a duty to fulfill. But as he made his way back to civilization, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Grave Mother's wrath was far from over.